By the summer of 1944, German intelligence estimates placed American tank production at roughly 12,000 units per year. The actual number was closer to 60,000. How an entire general staff, staffed with trained economists and military analysts, could be wrong, by a factor of 5, is a question that has never received a satisfactory answer in most histories of the war. And this is the part nobody talks about. In the autumn of 1944, as the last serious German armored offensive in the West was being planned in a converted railway tunnel in the Eifel region, the staff officers assigned to calculate the expected American reinforcement rate had a problem they could not solve. They had access to Swiss newspaper accounts, captured American field manuals, intercepted logistics summaries. They assembled all of this material, ran their calculations, and arrived at figures that their own commanding generals refused to accept, not because the figures were too high, but because they were too low. The generals had already seen American supply columns moving through liberated French villages in photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft. They believed the photographs showed deliberate staging. They believed the prisoners had been coached. They built their offensive plan around what they were willing to believe rather than what the figures showed them. The plan was the Ardennes offensive. It failed for many reasons, but one of the most fundamental was a miscalculation so deep it had become structural. The German High Command did not understand how many tanks the Americans had, because they had never been able to construct a model of American industrial capacity that corresponded to reality. German economists had read the published production figures in American trade journals, many of which were available without restriction through neutral countries throughout the war. None of it had produced a working understanding of what was actually happening in the industrial cities of the American Midwest. What was actually happening requires some explanation. The explanation begins not with tanks specifically, but with a set of decisions made at a level of the American economy that the German military analytical apparatus was not designed to observe or interpret. The German General Staff was organized to evaluate armies, and it was very good at evaluating armies. What it had no systematic method for evaluating was the civilian industrial base that fed those armies, particularly a civilian industrial base that had spent the previous 2 decades building automobiles, refrigerators, and farm machinery in quantities that had no European equivalent, and that could be converted, under the right conditions, into the production of military equipment at a speed that the German model of military economics had never anticipated. The German model assumed that producing military equipment was fundamentally different from producing civilian goods. Albert Speer, who understood German industry as well as any man alive, had spent 3 years trying to argue his own government out of this assumption. He had pushed repeatedly for the kind of standardization and mass production methods that would have allowed German factories to behave more like American ones. German tank production did increase substantially under his direction, rising from roughly 3,000 units in 1942 to nearly 18,000 in 1944. He knew those numbers. He also knew the American numbers. The distance between them was not something he could close by improving German efficiency. By the time he understood that clearly the war was already decided. The American assumption, which turned out to be correct, was almost precisely the opposite of the German one. The Americans believed, or at least their most effective production managers believed, that building a tank was essentially the same problem as building anything else at scale. You needed machine tools, you needed trained workers, you needed a rational production sequence. The specific object being manufactured was secondary. The organizational methods were primary. This belief was actually the product of roughly 30 years of accumulated practical experience in the American automobile industry. This was because Germany had never had an automobile industry that operated at comparable scale. The scale itself was the point. The Sherman tank program alone had required the coordinated effort of 11 different prime contractors with dozens of subcontractors supplying engines, transmissions, armor plate, optics, and radio equipment. A logistics network capable of moving finished vehicles from inland assembly plants to Atlantic ports, and from there across 3,000 miles of ocean to active combat theaters, all while maintaining a production rate that peaked in 1943 at more than 2,000 units per month. Managing that network required a kind of organizational capacity that had been built up in the American automobile industry beginning roughly in 1910 and refined through 30 years of competitive pressure into something that had no real equivalent anywhere else on Earth. The man who had done more than any other single individual to build that capacity was William Signius Knudsen, the Danish-born production manager whom Bernard Baruch had named 3 times over when Franklin Roosevelt asked for his best recommendation in the summer of 1940. Knudsen had arrived in Washington in June of that year and had immediately begun doing what he had spent his entire career doing. He had no authority to compel anyone to do anything. He had a government salary of $1 per year, and the personal credibility that came from having been the man who turned Chevrolet into the best-selling automobile in America and then run all of General Motors. Factory managers who would have ignored a government official with a briefcase full of directives spent hours with Knudsen because he spoke their language, understood their machinery, and had solved most of their problems before they had thought to describe them. One of the specific problems he addressed in the summer of 1940 was the question of where American tanks were going to be built. The United States Army in the spring of that year had a total armored vehicle inventory that was smaller than Belgium's. There was no dedicated tank production facility anywhere in the country. The existing capacity at the Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois could produce tanks in small numbers using traditional manufacturing methods. Knudsen understood this immediately. He also understood that the solution was not to build a government tank factory staffed by government workers. The solution was to find a private manufacturer who knew how to run an assembly line and persuade him to apply that knowledge to a new product. The private manufacturer he found was the Chrysler Corporation, then led by a Maryland-born engineer named Kaufman Thuma Keller. Keller had built his career on engineering precision and manufacturing discipline. He was not a visionary in the manner of Henry Ford. He was a man who understood how things were made and how to make more of them more reliably. That was exactly the skill the situation required. When Knudsen called him in June 1940 and asked whether Chrysler could produce tanks, Keller's answer was entirely characteristic. He said he didn't know enough about tanks yet to give an informed answer, but if Knudsen would arrange for him to look at one, he would tell him what was possible. They drove together to the Rock Island Arsenal. Keller spent several hours examining a medium tank M2A1, crawling around it, looking at the drivetrain, the suspension, the armor connections, asking questions of the ordnance officers who were present. At the end of that examination, he told Knudsen that Chrysler would build tanks on a moving assembly line in a new facility purpose-built for the task. The facility that resulted from that conversation was the Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, built on a former farm field near Warren, Michigan. Designed by the most important industrial architect in the United States, a German-born Jewish immigrant named Albert Kahn, who had spent 40 years designing factories for the American automobile industry, and who had, in a strange historical loop that most accounts of the war ignore entirely, spent the years between 1929 and 1932 designing more than 500 factories across the Soviet Union for Joseph Stalin's first 5-year plan. Albert Kahn had designed the manufacturing plants that produced the tanks that were killing the soldiers of the country where he had been born. The Detroit Arsenal plant that Kahn designed for Chrysler had walls 3 feet thick and a roof engineered to support a second floor that was never built. Construction commenced in September 1940. The first M3 Lee medium tank rolled off the completed line on the 24th of April 1941. Before the surrounding buildings were fully enclosed, the plant was producing tanks faster than the Ordnance Department had believed possible when the contract was signed. By the time the United States entered the war in December 1941, Chrysler's Warren facility had already demonstrated something that German military economists had not included in their models. That was the speed at which an American automobile manufacturer could convert to a new product once the decision to convert had been made at the executive level. The German model of industrial mobilization assumed that conversion took years, because it had taken years in Germany. This was because German manufacturing culture was built around craft specialization. American automobile manufacturing had evolved in a very different direction, toward workers who performed narrowly defined, highly repetitive tasks on a moving assembly line. This distinction had very concrete consequences when those manufacturing systems were pointed at military production. The M4 Sherman, which replaced the M3 Lee as the standard American medium tank beginning in 1942, was produced by 11 different manufacturers at facilities spread across the American industrial Midwest and East. The Fisher Body Division of General Motors produced Shermans at a plant in Grand Blanc, Michigan. The Ford Motor Company produced them at its River Rouge complex. The Pressed Steel Car Company, the Pacific Car and Foundry Company, the Baldwin Locomotive Works, and the American Locomotive Company all built Shermans. Each using somewhat different manufacturing equipment and supply chains, but all producing vehicles that were interchangeable in their major components and fully compatible in their ammunition, fuel requirements, and spare parts. This kind of multi-manufacturer standardization had never been attempted in German tank production, where each manufacturer produced vehicles to slightly different tolerances, and where spare parts from one factory often did not fit vehicles from another. Speer had identified this problem clearly, and had tried to address it through rationalization programs that achieved some success, but never achieved the degree of standardization that American production had built in from the beginning. This was because American standardization had been a commercial necessity. Automobile dealers across the United States had been demanding interchangeable spare parts since roughly 1910. Henry Ford's solution to that problem had been to standardize his components so rigorously that a part made in 1 month at one plant would fit a vehicle made in a different month at a different plant. Knudsen had carried that discipline from Ford to General Motors and had spent 20 years refining it. When the Sherman program was organized, the standardization requirements were written into the production contracts from the beginning. German intelligence understood that the Americans were producing Shermans at multiple facilities. What they could not assess accurately was the output rate of each facility. This was because the Americans had implemented security measures around production statistics that were significantly more effective than their security around almost any other category of wartime information. Production figures were classified at a higher level than many operational details. German attachés and intelligence officers working through neutral countries collected fragmentary data throughout the war and consistently underestimated the total by substantial margins. The estimates that reached the German General Staff in the months before the Ardennes offensive were, as the post-war interrogation records show clearly, known by some of the officers preparing them to be unreliable. The productive capacity that the Germans were underestimating had not existed in anything like its wartime form before 1940. The United States in the spring of that year was producing fewer tanks annually than Czechoslovakia, a country that had ceased to exist as an independent state the previous year. The transformation that occurred between June 1940 and the end of 1943 was not the result of a single decision or a single program. It was the result of thousands of individual decisions made by factory managers, procurement officers, engineers, and production workers across hundreds of facilities, coordinated by a small number of individuals who understood both the military requirement and the industrial capacity available to meet it. Knudsen was the most important of those individuals, But he was operating within a system that had structural advantages his German counterparts could not replicate by any exercise of will or policy. This was because those advantages had been built into the American industrial economy over decades and could not be conjured into existence on a shorter timeline. One of the structural advantages that received the least attention in German assessments was the American machine tool industry. Machine tools are the machines that make other machines, the lathes, milling machines, grinding machines, and presses that cut, shape, and finish metal parts to the precise dimensions required for assembly. The United States in 1940 had the largest and most productive machine tool industry in the world. When the rearmament program began in 1940, the American machine tool industry was able to expand its own production rapidly because it already had the trained workers, the specialized knowledge, and the capital equipment to do so. Germany's machine tool industry, that was also sophisticated and productive, faced a different constraint. That was that it had been running at or near full capacity for military production since roughly 1936 and had no reserve of capacity to draw on when demands increased further. American machine tool builders were able to deliver new equipment to tank plants within months of receiving orders. German armaments factories were often waiting a year or more for machine tools that had been ordered at the beginning of a production program. The cumulative effect of these differences in standardization, in machine tool availability, in the scale of the existing manufacturing base, in the organizational methods of the production managers who were directing the effort, was a gap in armored vehicle production that widened continuously from 1942 onward, and that could not be narrowed by any adjustment the German side was capable of making within the time available. Speer's rationalization programs, his committees, his production drives, all of it produced real results, and none of it was sufficient to change the fundamental arithmetic. By 1944, German tank production had reached its wartime peak and was beginning to fall again as Allied bombing disrupted fuel supplies and transportation networks. American production was still increasing. The officers planning the Ardennes offensive in the autumn of 1944 were aware that American production capacity exceeded anything their models had predicted in 1941. They were aware that the replacement rate for American armored losses was faster than the replacement rate for German losses by a significant margin. They planned the offensive anyway, on the theory that a rapid advance to Antwerp would split the Allied armies, cut their supply lines, and force a negotiated settlement before American production capacity could be brought fully to bear. It had not worked, and by Speer's own account he had not believed it would work. This was because he had read the production figures every week. The figures told a story that the theory was not equipped to survive. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant at Warren, Michigan, produced its last tank in June 1945, 6 weeks after Speer's interrogation ended. Over the course of the war, that single facility had manufactured more than 22,000 tanks, a number that exceeded the total armored vehicle production of several major European powers combined across the entire conflict.